Let's take a moment and pray together before we get started with our class period. Our great and glorious God in heaven, we praise you and glorify you as the center of our lives. We're so thankful that you've revealed yourself to us and that we can study your word and learn more about your will for our lives, your guidance, and how to be righteous in your sight. We're thankful for the grace and mercy that comes through the blood of Jesus Christ, without which we could not be righteous in your sight. We ask, Father, that you go with us during this time of Bible study. We ask that you help us to glean from your scriptures those things that will help us to strengthen our faith and deepen our connection to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, hopefully you've got the handout on Wednesday night. The Moores are out of town, so we're doing something a little bit different this morning. We're going to be talking about Adam. When we talk about character studies, we tend to go with big names like Moses and Abraham and Jesus and the apostles and different things. And Adam doesn't seem to get talked about a whole lot. We don't have a huge amount of information about Adam, but we have more than some people in the Bible. What's your initial thoughts about Adam? When you first saw what the study was going to be today, what was your initial thought about it? Okay, not a lot said about him. George?
Well, I was thinking the best place to start is first man.
Okay.
Good way to start.
Well, what's your first impression of him? When we say Adam, you feel good about him or you kind of feel bad about him? I'm sorry?
He was a perfect sinner.
Okay, so maybe a negative impression of him is the first thing that comes to mind.
The example of man in general, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I think he does represent that struggle, even though he had the greatest blessings that any man has had walking upon this earth. Is there another comment?
I think he did what God wanted him to, except for the fruit. He tended in the garden.
Yeah, I mean, he lived a long life, but really we kind of get the beginning and then that's pretty much it. We don't get a lot of other stuff. What? Sorry about that. All right, so when we're thinking about Adam, I gave you some readings at the top, and hopefully that was enough to help you stimulate some thoughts about Adam. But the first question is, in what manner and in what order did God create man? Okay, and what does that mean? What does it mean in God's own image? Okay, with a soul, and what does that mean? Besides having something more than what we can see, what's the implications of having a soul? Okay, in the spiritual image of God, but it separates us from the rest of creation. There's something different about man than there is about dogs, cows, lions, tigers, anything else that God made. It's not just an intellectual capacity, but it's more than that. It's a moral capacity. And because God gave us a moral capacity, He also requires us to be accountable morally. And so to be in the image of God is to have that spirit, to have that capacity, to have that free will to make a choice. So, for example, what we consider to be dogs, fairly intelligent, maybe cats too, don't know as much about cats. But we get a puppy and we start teaching it things. You might teach it tricks, you might teach it what your expectations are. But does that mean the dog has free will choice the way man does? How do we train the dog? Based on instinct, but usually food, a treat. Does what we tell it to do, you get a treat. So just kind of along those lines, I saw a picture of somebody this past week that their dog had gotten in the habit of they'd go into the laundry basket and steal a sock. And what they started doing was, give me the sock, I'll give you a treat. So guess what happens now? The dog shows up with a sock every time it wants a treat. So it's just that little bit of training, but based on food. But that's not free will choice. Free will choice is looking at a situation and saying, okay, I can make a good choice and I can make a bad choice. Now, which one am I going to make? That's the choice that it comes down to. And when we say good and bad, we're talking about sin and righteousness. You know, we have a moral choice of what's right and what's wrong. That we can choose to do what's right. We can choose to do what's wrong. That is the moral choice. In what order did God create man? Well, in terms of the days of creation, man came on, at the end, day 6, right before God rested. In terms of man and woman, which came first? Man. There's 1 Timothy 2, verse 13 for you. Question 2, what did God call the man whom he made?
That was interesting.
What is Adam a name or is Adam something else? In the original language, all it meant was man. That's all it was. But we adapted it into a proper name and made it Adam. So now our Bibles say Adam, but it was more of a general name for mankind. It was man. Where? Okay.
Because it doesn't say he called. In my versions, I looked at different versions. It didn't say he called man Adam. It just all of a sudden there was a reference. Adam did this in verse 20.
Yeah. Well, if you go to like chapter 1, verse 26, when he says, let us make man in our image, that's the word that becomes Adam. So it's the translators that put man in some places and Adam in other places.
Yeah, I'm just saying, you don't see Adam until the 2nd chapter, verse 20.
Right. Right. And so where did God put him when he created him? Okay, so you've got two ways you can answer that question. You've got the order of creation and man's place in it. And sometimes I refer to man's place in creation as man was the pinnacle. I mean, everything was created in order to support what his intention was, which was to create man. But where physically did he put him? Garden of Eden. And we have a little bit of description about some rivers that were around the area. If we think about the state of this world today and understand that before the flood, I don't believe the world looked the way that it does today. But if we just look at the state of the world today, and you think about these rivers and the area of the world in which we're talking about, those rivers would have been required in order to have plant life, right? So the idea of talking about all these rivers would have been there was abundant availability of water, which was required in order to have that plant life. Otherwise, when you get away from the rivers in that part of the world, what do you have? Yeah, sand, nothingness. You know, you've got a few oases here and there, but without those rivers, there's really nothing. And what God give him to do? I mean, was he supposed to just wander around the garden all day, just kind of looking at all the plants, or what was he supposed to do? Well, yes, he did end up naming the animals, but in terms of the garden, what was he supposed to do? Keep it and tend to it. I have no idea what that means. You know, I don't know if it's, the idea of the way we keep a vegetable garden today, get the weeds out or that kind of thing. I tend to think that's probably not what it was. But then again, I really don't have any idea of what his day-to-day activity might have been like. But what do we recognize because God gave him that responsibility? Yeah, man's supposed to be doing something. We're not supposed to be just sitting back and twiddling our thumbs. Even Adam, even before sin and before any other people in the world, he had something to do. And I think there's some wisdom in that. Because what happens to man when we tend to just be idle? Yeah, we get ourselves in a lot of trouble when we sit idle. And so God gave him something to do. Number 5, over what did God give man authority? Pretty much everything. Especially when we're talking about land-based, right? because it talks about everything that breathes. You can look at that in a couple of ways and say that, animals in the sea still breathe, but they breathe in a different way. But if we just take it as breathing air, then we're talking about animals upon the land. And when we do see all the creatures come and Adam goes through it and names them, what kind of relationship do you imagine there between Adam and creation?
Seems that the animals had no fear of him if they were around him.
Okay, didn't seem like the animals had any fear of him, and it didn't seem like he had any fear of the animals either. I'm not sure I want to stand face to face with a full-grown lion, for example, but what's that based on? Yeah, my knowledge of what a wild animal is like today. So that leads me to believe that maybe the animals even behaved a little bit differently during this time than we see today. That there was a different relationship going on there. Any other comments? Rachel?
Well, it says that he gave the plants as food for the animals. He didn't say animal eat animal. He said that he had all these plants for them to eat. So I think back then they didn't eat each other. They didn't, eat meats back then.
Yeah, it mentions that it gave every green plant, and then later it gives a little bit more detail about, what was edible and that sort of thing. Yeah. All right. So what liberties did God give man at this time? I mean, he's basically got one rule, right? Okay, so the one rule was don't eat of the forbidden fruit, which is of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, so what liberties did he give them? Pretty much anything else. Why didn't God give them more rules? I mean, we've got a lot of rules to live by today. Why didn't God give Adam and Eve more rules?
They didn't sin, therefore didn't think those guys.
Right. Until they sinned and started that process, if you will, of succumbing to sin, there was no need to give rules, which are, yes, rules are to restrain us, but what else do rules do? They teach us. In other words, for example, don't commit murder. Well, maybe we might like everybody that's around us, and so we wouldn't have that desire to commit murder. But without being told that that's something that's wrong or figuring it out, how would you know?
Like Peter said, you bring everything to our remembrance. This is the same thing here too.
Okay, so the liberty was you can do whatever you want as long as you don't partake of this forbidden fruit. The rule was don't eat of that fruit. That's it. That's all we have recorded about any guidance or rules or guidelines that God gave to him. All right, now this is sort of jumping ahead a little bit toward the end of the Genesis account, but what responsibility did Adam was given to Adam regarding his wife?
Head of the wife, as Christ was head of the church.
Okay, yeah, we do know that, but based on the Genesis account, what do we see as the responsibility of Adam over his wife?
He was to hold fast to his wife and become one flesh.
Okay, so you have therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What else? Right, he was to rule over her. Now that's after the fall, but do you think that principle was only after the fall? I doubt it. I doubt it. So again, just because we have little information does not mean that there was not more going on. Why does the Bible only record certain facts for us and not give us everything that happened? We get what we need. And how long were they in the garden? I mean, if you just read it through and it's so quick and short, you might think, a couple of days. But what's the reality? It could have been years, could have been decades even. We have no idea. It could have been just a matter of days. There's no information whatsoever that guides us into any even guessing as to how long they were in the garden. We don't have that at all. So this responsibility kind of comes to the forefront when they sin, right? Because Eve brings Adam the fruit. What does he do? He takes and eats. What should he have done? He should have said, you shouldn't even be touching that. You know better. That's forbidden. So kind of jumping ahead toward later in our lesson, but we'll address it right now. What was this for Adam? Yeah, it was a failure. It was a failure of character because he did not speak up. He gave in. Now, we have a little bit more revealed about that. Eve was deceived. Was Adam deceived? Adam was not deceived. So Adam made a free will choice to do that which was wrong, even when he knew it was wrong. We need to remember that. He made that free will choice to do that which was wrong, even though he knew that it was wrong. So, last question on the bottom of the page. What transgression did Adam commit? He ate of that forbidden fruit when Eve offered it. And what does a transgression imply? Sin, choice, violating rules, violating authority. You can put it in a lot of different word forms. But the fact is, God told him what not to do, and what did Adam do? He disobeyed. He did it anyway. Now, people like to think today, I can sin and God will forgive me, so it doesn't really matter. What does the situation with Adam and Eve teach us about sin and God's mercy? There's consequences. It does matter. And frankly, the wages of sin is death, so what should have happened to Adam and Eve as soon as they ate of the forbidden fruit? They should have died. So let's understand one thing. It was mercy that they did not die and lose their life right then. What else do we learn from them? They did eventually die. Yeah, death comes into the world. Remember that when they threw them out of the garden, what did God discuss among the Godhead? They would return to the dust, but they walled them off from the Garden of Eden. Why? Yeah, so they wouldn't eat of the tree of life and live a long time or forever. Not really clear exactly what that tree did, but it was blocked off from them, and so yes, they did die. But we also learned there are dire consequences to sin, whether we experience the immediate spiritual death or some form in thereof. There's still those consequences. What was the consequence for them? There's several, by the way, but right? Disease comes, sickness comes, but what we see right then is they lost, number one, a relationship in which they would be in the garden and God would walk through the garden. Number two, they lost access to the garden, and the garden was God's care for them. He provided everything they needed. Yes, he was supposed to tend it and keep it, but I mean, did he go and plant? Was he working like we think about growing food today? No, that came after, because he said, now cursed is the ground, and now you're going to have to work and sweat and toil and have pain, and you're going to have weeds and thorns and thistles and all those different things. So it went from God providing everything to them having to work very hard in order to have any food. What else? Well, you have the pain in childbirth part for Eve. You have the contrary relationship they might have, the differences between them, but she needed to submit to his leadership. All of those things come into the punishment for that transgression. But when it comes down to Adam being confronted, remember, what happened when they first ate of the forbidden fruit? Okay, they realized they were naked. Before that point, it never bothered them. They never had that realization. It was not something that made any difference to them. And what did they do? Yeah, they hid themselves, even from God. Now, just taking this as today they sinned, yesterday they hadn't sinned, assuming God did this every day, God saw them in their nakedness the day before, but now today something's different. What's different? It's knowledge and guilt. It's the forbidden fruit was that tree of knowledge of good and evil. And Satan didn't lie to her in that regard. He told her that then she would know those things. But was that a blessing or a curse? It was a curse. So they hide themselves. God says, "Where are you?" As if he really needs to ask that question. God doesn't really need to ask Adam and Eve, "Where are you?" He knows. He already knows what's going on. But what did God want them to do? He wanted them to own up to their sin. And when Eve speaks up, what does she say? The serpent deceived me. The serpent convinced me. When Adam speaks up, what does he say? Yeah, this woman you gave me. What does that say? I mean, what is he doing? Passing the buck, not taking responsibility.
In that sense, nothing has changed.
Right? Well, that's part of the way man tends to react. But let me ask you this. Is there ever repentance without an acceptance of the responsibility of sin? Because if you won't accept responsibility, then you can't make the statement, "I have sinned, I need to change, I need to be forgiven." You can't do it. So until we just accept, no matter what anybody else did, no matter what the circumstance was, no matter what happened around me, I am the one who made the choice. I'm the one who did it. So the whole deal with Nathan and David. Nathan presents the story of the little ewe lamb. And David's reaction to the story is, he's outraged, he's upset. How dare somebody go take the only ewe lamb this family has that was cherished by them when this man had plenty? He was outraged. He saw the sin in the matter. Then Nathan brought it home and said, "It's you. You're the man." That was when David accepted responsibility. That was when David saw his sin. And so Adam, by passing the buck, by saying, that it's just because this happened, that was him not accepting responsibility. So he tries to cover it up. He tries to blame Eve. Audrey?
I was just going to say, we talk about all these things that they lost after the fact, but they didn't know they were going to lose those things. They just knew that God gave them this role. So I'm not saying that they're good in doing this. I'm just saying that they didn't know. They were ignorant of that fact.
As far as we know, yes, they were ignorant of the consequence that would come from that sin. I don't know for sure if that's the case or not. Like I said, what we have recorded about these events is a little on the sparse side because it's not what's intended for us. What's intended for us is just to know how sin came into the world, how things got started, how mankind came about, how creation happened. All right, so under thought questions. What character traits do you see in Adam, good or bad? Okay, what do you see good about him? In what way? Okay, their reaction to the realization that they were naked. They tried to do something about it. Okay. Any other character traits you see in Adam? Rachel?
He was creative enough to come up with all those names for the animals.
Okay. Creative. Okay. Diane?
He had two main flaws. First, he wouldn't admit it was his fault, sin, and then he tried to blame it on somebody else. So, to me, his character had not been developed.
Right. And a lot of what we think about the character of Adam is sort of reading between the lines, because really we see a little bit more about the effect regarding his family than we see specifically about Adam. George?
She nailed it.
Okay. So really we can name a little bit more bad about Adam than we can good, but that's primarily because have a recording of the downfall of man, the fall of man because of sin. Audrey?
He listened to his wife when he should have listened to God.
Okay. All right. So you're trying to say that men shouldn't listen to their wives? Is that what I'm just kidding. All right. What effect did Adam's sin have upon his wife and children then? Okay, hardship.
One man's,
Okay, thorns, thistles, pain.
one man's sin. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to get there in a minute. We'll get there in a minute. All right, so let's think about, fast forward to Cain and Abel. They're offering sacrifices to the Lord. So obviously, what did Adam do? Well, I'm sure that he sacrificed too, but he taught them. And so we can give him credit in that. He taught them about God, teaching them about requirements of God, whatever was along the way for the time. Remember, this is a patriarchal period in which, the head of a household would disseminate that type of information before you had the prophets and the written record of the laws of God. So Cain and Abel, even though it was a terrible tragedy that happens, we do see that they're carrying out some of the things. And of course, why was Cain upset? Yeah, his sacrifice was not accepted. And God told him, what? If you do well, you'll be accepted. In other words, if you do right, you'll be accepted. So there's some mercy involved there too. So when we're thinking about the effect of Adam's sin upon his wife and his children, it was like a snowball going downhill, right? Because sin doesn't stop. It hasn't stopped. Sin is still in the world. And so, can you imagine the anguish of Adam when Cain kills Abel? I can't imagine what that would be like. It's beyond my comprehension. But Adam had to live with that. And Adam lived how long? That's an awfully long time. And so, in terms of mankind, when did Adam die? Well, no, I don't mean spiritually. I'm talking about physically.
There was a long list of contemporaries that people had.
It was the time of Noah's grandfather. So he died about the time that Noah's grandfather is born. And by the time Noah is of full age and he's got a family, what do we know about the world? Yeah, all evil continually. 8 souls were saved. Adam had to witness all that. I don't know how bad it was by the time he dies, but that had to be quite a burden. All right, so what effect does Adam's sin have on us? Sin is still here. Sin is a lot of times referred to as corruption. And corruption is akin to decay. When sin came into the world, creation began to decay. People ask, why is there so much sickness and death? Why does it seem like diseases get worse? I think that's why. That's my take on it, my opinion on it. I think it's because of the decay of this world around us. DNA is decaying. It's not as pure as it was when God made it. There's all these defects and abnormalities that come about. What happens in nature when you have an abnormality? The bottom line is that whatever gets the abnormality usually dies. It doesn't live. And so that's physical effects of sin. What are the spiritual effects of Adam's sin on us? Yeah, it's that legacy of sin, right? How would you like to have that legacy? Now, does that mean that Adam was not saved? Do we know? Do we have anything in the scriptures that tells us whether Adam was saved? I can't think of any. I can't think of any even in a roundabout way in which it tells us. Now, what would I like to think? I'd like to think that he was. Yeah, but I mean just aside from whether Adam tried to follow God or not, whether he decided to abandon completely or follow him. But for us, we find 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 22 and 45. What does that tell us? Let's go over there and read it. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 22. Well, let's start in verse 21. 1 Corinthians 15, 21. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. Who's the second man? Christ. Okay? For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. Then verse 45. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So what's the effect of Adam's sin upon us?
And one man's sin came into the world. And one man's obedience, we all have salvation.
Yeah, so you have one imperfect man that sinned and started that legacy. Then one perfect man, God dwelling in flesh, who did not sin, who was the only avenue for a perfect sacrifice to redeem us. That's a life-giving spirit. So what's the point of telling us that, by Adam, sin came into the world?
Shows us that when God says do a certain thing, that's what you need to do.
Okay, so perhaps it teaches us the importance of following what God tells us. But what's Paul's point when he's, talks about Adam being a type of Christ? George?
It tells me that man wasn't born sinful, but he made a choice.
Okay.
Therefore, that ideology that babies are sinful creatures and have to be cleansed of that is false from the beginning.
Okay.
So we learn that there is a right and a wrong through Adam.
Okay. All right. So we see that free will choice and that God didn't make us to be sinful. I saw a discussion this past week of somebody asked another preacher the question, if God knew we were going to sin, why did he make us with the capacity to sin? Well, the answer that ended up coming down to was the choice to love God doesn't mean anything if it's not a choice. And so God had to give us the choice either way. Free will to choose to love God and obey his commandments, or to turn from God and follow our own will and our own ways. So the whole point that Adam it fits into all of this is just to know that very thing, that there is a free will choice, even when there was only one rule, just one rule. Now let's address very quickly the idea that we inherit Adam's sin. Is that what Paul is telling them? That they have inherited Adam's sin?
And we get our own sin.
Okay, so We all are going to stand before the judgment seat of God. And whose sins do I answer for? Mine. But how do I know that we don't inherit Adam's sin?
We get the consequences of his sin.
Okay. Ezekiel chapter 18, for example, around about verse 20. The soul that sins shall die. The one that commits the sin is the one that's guilty of it and would then reap the consequences of that sin. Yes, there are consequences that are handed down because of what Adam did. There are consequences from your parents for any sins they committed. Some sins have lasting consequences. Consequences do not equate guilt. I am not guilty for the sin of Adam. I am guilty for the sins of Daryl. That's it. We need to realize that. Any comments?
Jesus used the illustration of the little children, such are these that will inherit the kingdom of heaven. So there's an implication right there that these young children, their souls are still pure
Right.
until a certain point.
Yeah. Yeah, they're innocent in motive, they're innocent in intention. And even small children that do things that we know are morally wrong, why do they do them?
Because they've seen somebody else do it.
They're mimicking somebody else. Right. Yeah. They haven't come to that knowledge yet of good and evil. All right, question 3 then. How does Adam measure up as a husband and father? Well, let's start with husband. How does he measure up as a husband? From what we have recorded. Yeah. We don't see any correction toward Eve. We don't see any questioning. We don't see a refusal to partake, even if she's going to eat it. So I would classify him in that moment as a failure as a husband.
I put down that at least he didn't run off and leave.
Okay. At least he didn't run off and leave him. If the bar's set pretty low, then I guess, we can give him credit. But in that moment, Adam should have provided leadership, but he did not. Now, for the sake of argument, let's just say the roles are reversed. Let's just say that Adam is the one that goes and gets the fruit and he brings it to Eve. Would I have a different expectation of Eve? She may not be the leader of the home, as we might term it, but would I not expect Eve to speak up and say, you can't do that. That's wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. I'm not going to do that. So I just want us to be clear. I'm not giving Adam this huge expectation that I wouldn't give to Eve. If it was reversed, I would want to see Eve speak up as well. So he did not lead her away from sin, but instead, by going along with it, he aids and abets her sin. Now, from what I can tell, they're doing this together. So maybe Adam could have prevented that. What about as a father? Again, this is a case we got to read a little bit between the lines because we don't have a lot of information. So we already talked about the credit column. We'll give him credit that he must have taught them about God because Cain and Abel are offering sacrifices. And what do we know about Seth? Anybody? And he was a follower of God. A lot of times, we talk about Sethites, the lineage of Seth. It was a lineage that followed God. So on the credit side, we can see that he taught them about these things. Now, does that mean that fathers are responsible for everything their kids do? I mean, how old was Cain and Abel? I would presume that they're of full-grown age, just because they're out doing their own thing with regards to their profession, and then they're bringing those sacrifices. So I presume that they are of adult age. And once our kids are adults, our influence diminishes. because they are at that point where they are making their own choices. They're not necessarily under our watchful eye all the time. Sometimes as parents, we'd like to be able to continue to keep that control in place and guide them with a little firmer hand. But what's the reality? Yep, they have to make their own choices. So we could maybe give him the credit on one side and maybe say that, they did some terrible things, but at some point, those kids had to make their own choices. All right, so question 4, we kind of already answered this, but we'll go over it. In what respect is Adam a type of Christ?
Adam was, he was the father of the human race physically.
Okay.
Christ spiritually.
Okay. Well, specifically, 1 Corinthians 15:45, Adam brought sin in, and what did Christ do? Yeah, he conquered it. Yeah, he conquered sin. No death, where is your sting? Where is your victory? For a follower of Christ, one who is covered by the blood of Christ, that sin has no power. All right, last question. We'll squeeze this in before class is over. What is one great lesson you can take away from Adam's life?
We're all sinners. We all need salvation. We all need to follow the commands of God. One of the things is to be a good husband, wife, rule over. But it also means that I have responsibility not to sin, as well as she has enough responsibility to sin.
Okay. All right. Any others? What's your bottom line? Harold? Yeah, I've always thought that's interesting too. God didn't just wipe away the garden, he guarded it. So they could see it. Presumably they could come close enough to see and reminisce and realize what they lost. So yes, that would be a terrible loss. Audrey?
Sinning is bad all the way around, so stand firm in your integrity.
Okay. All right, stand firm in your integrity. Rachel?
Even if you don't understand the reasons behind God's rules, you should still follow them, because there's always going to be a consequence.
And that's a good one because, especially when we're younger in the faith, we don't understand everything that God gives us through his wisdom. And so there has to be that point in which by faith I just accept and do, even if I don't understand the reasoning. And what happens after a couple of decades of life experience? That made a lot of sense. And then we either say one of two things: I'm glad I followed that, or I wish I'd followed that. Right. Well, my final point to leave you with is stand firm no matter what anybody else does do or doesn't do. You are the one that is accountable to God. And that includes even your spouse. You are the one that's going to stand before God. Audrey can't stand for me. I can't stand for her. And when I reach that day of judgment, my fate will be sealed. I don't get to argue and say, that woman you gave me doesn't work that way. Didn't work that way for Adam. It's not going to work that way for me. I got to stand on my own 2 feet. So it's my job to do what's right. Thank you for listening. We'll have our break before our worship service. And next week, Brother Robert will continue his class.